What's up, everybody? This is Alex with Shōnan and we are going to do a briefish history on the gaming console world. As you can see, these are the consoles that I happen to have. You'll notice in that spot right there, that is blank. That would be the 7th generation, the PS3s, the Xbox, 360, I think and the Wii. I believe the Wii would be part of that generation. I do have the Wii, and I do have the PS3. I actually have two of those things. I was gonna put them out there. I'm not going to dive into that generation because, in my humble opinion, I don't technically think that generation is done just yet. I think it's about to. Experts believe that that generation ended 5 years ago, but I still know people that are still playing the PS3 that still only own a PS3 because they couldn't afford the PS4, so on and so forth. So I'm going to leave that out. Plus, the majority of the people that are watching this should at least know what a PS3 and Xbox 360 and a Wii are. I will talk about the PS3 and the Wii in a separate video. I will talk about each and every individual one of these things in greater depth in their own respective videos. But for this one, we're just going to do a brief overview of the generations as a whole. And then, obviously, I'm not going to talk about Generation 8, which we're in now, and Generation 9, which I believe the PS5 and all the other systems are going to drop in a few months, I think. So we're almost about ready to enter Generation 9, which is pretty incredible. But what you're seeing right here, at least for me, is you have your Generation 2, Generation 3, Generation 4, Generation 5, and Generation 6 is right down in there, which is literally just the two. Sorry, this is kind of weird to do, which is just the same two systems: the original PlayStation 2 and the PlayStation 2 Slim. So these are the systems that I have, just in case anyone that watches this or anyone from Facebook that happens to watch this, if you're interested in watching me play games, which I will do anyways, but if you're interested in watching a system, this is the options as of right now. The Nintendo does not work at the moment. I think the 72 pin has an issue, so I ordered one. I'm hoping that that's the problem with that, because that was a good deal. I got that and a bunch of controllers, the RF switch, the power supply, for $50. I thought that was a hell of a deal. And I did disengage the 10 NES security lockout system thing, so I don't have that stupid blinking light situation anymore. The Fairchild Channel F does not work. I can't get it to register, and believe me, you guys will see in probably the Atari video that I have a pretty goddamn old TV. Actually, you'll probably see in a minute, because I'm going to show you guys that. I do apologize. My room is rather tiny. Actually, it's a decent sized room, but you'll see that it's pretty full of stuff. I do not have any first gen consoles. That would be really awesome. I'm definitely keeping an eye out. So the Fairchild would be the oldest system, and then obviously I have a PS4, which would be the newest system. There is a PS1. There's actually two PS1s lying around somewhere. I just wasn't able to find them, but I do have them. But the PS1 is still part of that generation, that little guy right there. And I won't even be using that when I play PlayStation games, because this particular PS2 works. I don't know where the hell it came from. Mine broke. My buddy fell on it. So that's why we got the Slim. But this one actually works, and this one is backwards compatible, so all the PlayStation games will be played on that system. The Genesis also, it works, but I don't know where the AV cables are for it. So we're going to end up using this pretty neat little shape-shifting Tango by AT Games. Classic game console. It has games built into it, which is pretty nifty, but it also can play the cartridges, which was really cool. There was a Nintendo one about this size, but it didn't play the cartridges, and that was kind of useless to me because I have a few cartridges I would like to play, but that's what we use with that. But anyways, that's just a brief look at the systems themselves, and we'll go into greater detail in just a second with each specific generation. But just to let you know, I'm not joking. Let me just loosen this a bit. Those are all games. The consoles were in there, but those are all games. As you can see, my old radio, records and stuff. And then behind me is actually tons of games, hundreds of games, mostly for the PlayStation. You'll notice the PlayStation was the system that I really grew up with. But yeah, so let's take it over to Generation 1. So the first gen, which technically is considered to have begun in 1972, and only lasted until 1983, which is when the massive video game crash of 1983 happened, which we'll talk about more so with the second generation. Was started off by a company called Magnavox. Magnavox, I believe to this day, is still a subsidiary. It's a part of Philips, but originally the company was based out of Napa. So that's up north from me in the Bay Area. And they came out with, and I apologize, this picture is super tiny. But this little guy, which is the Odyssey. The Odyssey, you'll notice the original systems were built-in games, which kind of made it a problem because then you'd have to buy another console to get another game or another set of games. But this one was Pong. Pong was kind of, well, it was technically, it wasn't called Pong. Atari was the one that called it Pong. This was basically just tennis, and that controller right here is basically just a little knob that you would twist in order to get the, if you've ever seen Pong, Pong essentially has a line going down. It's a little dot on one side, a little dot on the other side, and then a dot in the middle, which the computer controls, and then you control up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. The paddle, or it's the dot, What this came with, which makes this even more funny, because this is 1972 we're talking about here, is pieces of, I guess, vinyl or some kind of plastic that would cling to the static on the TV, and you could set up, borders and all kinds of stuff depending on what game you were playing to kind of enhance the game itself. So you actually had to go out of your way to modify your own TV to make the game more realistic, I suppose, which I thought was kind of interesting within itself. The Magnavox led to Atari adopting what they called the home Pong system, which, shoot, I meant to get a picture of that one. I'm sorry, I did not get a picture of that one. But the home Pong system was Atari's first system that came out as a result of what the Odyssey was doing. Atari, which most people have heard of. People probably heard of Magnavox, but not from a video game standpoint. Maybe like TVs and other kinds of electronics. But Atari was based out of Sunnyvale, so you kind of had the North Bay versus the South Bay kind of thing going on there. But they did come out with the home Pong system. Again, I apologize, I don't have a picture of that one. Nintendo, believe it or not, which originally wasn't a video game company, they were actually an electronics company. to begin with. They entered in 1977 with what was called the Color TV game series. And this industrial looking thing is technically the first Nintendo system the world saw. As you can see though, none of this is in English. Let's see if I can read some of this. This is either Sol or N. Nope. Nope. I can kind of see some of the characters. But anyways, you can tell that this is all in Japanese. This was never... I don't think this ever really made it. This was never supposed to make it across the pond. It has crossed the pond, obviously. Of course, one of my systems, the Famicom, is not supposed to be a U.S. market system, but it's here, and it is playable. But that was Nintendo's kind of shtick into the market. But again, that never really made it over. The only other system of note I wanted to call out, because they'll be mentioned later, is the Coleco Telestar. And this was Coleco's first dip of the toe into the pond of consoles. And as you can see here, these would be the games that would be built into the system. So you have tennis, hockey, and handball. Essentially, Pong, and Pong, just in various forms. But that's all you really had back then. Pong, and Pong. One would bounce off a wall. One you could move, you're just trying to score goals, and then one was just straight tennis. The Channel F, which we're talking about in a bit, was pretty interesting the way they had theirs set up. I'll try to explain it because I don't have a picture of it. There's a great video. There's a bunch of great videos on YouTube. There's even better videos about history than what I'm doing right now. And if you're interested, definitely check them out. But the Channel F version is pretty interesting. But anyways, this is the Coleco Telestar. And this one didn't do as well as what Magnavox's Odyssey and what Atari's Home Pong was doing. But I did want to throw it out there because Coleco will come up again in a little bit. But the first gen, it was kind of expensive. And believe it or not, it's going to be kind of weird for people to think of that, considering how humongous video games are nowadays as a business and as a cultural phenomenon. But video games still weren't a huge deal during this generation. And the three systems that I mentioned, the Magnavox, Odyssey, the Atari Home Pong, and the Nintendo Color TV game series, they were pretty expensive in their time. The Magnavox went for $100, which is about a little over $600 today. The Atari went for just shy of $100, and that one was about $470 today. And then the Nintendo over in Japan sold for up to 48,000 yen, which at that time I guess would be the equivalent of like 65,347 yen. So that's probably about $600 as well in yen today. But this generation got overlapped pretty quickly by the second generation, and the second generation is where we get what we really truly know today, and a big reason why these home consoles started to take off, and that is because of the cartridge. The fact that you were able to take a game, this one is obviously not for this, but I don't have a cartridge for this one yet, but the cartridge, the reprogrammable ROM cartridge, is what really started to set off consoles and allowed multiple games as opposed to them being built in. Now, the Channel F by Fairchild, originally it was called the Video Entertainment System, which I'll take that. the video entertainment system, was the first system of this new second generation, which started in 1976. This came out in 1976. This was the very first game to utilize insertable cartridges. They also did have some games built in. Hockey is right there, tennis right there. And another thing which is really interesting, and we kind of take it for granted nowadays, but if you're playing a game and all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, I kind of need to pee. You couldn't pause back then. Hell, you couldn't even pause on the Atari. Now I come to think of it, which is part of this generation. This button right here is a hold button. This was actually the first system to utilize a pause feature. I don't believe any of the other second generations utilized that. That was more of a third generation, but this guy happened to use that. Which, by the way, I apologize for all the cables. You really won't see much more of this after the second generation, but everything, even this humongous heavy power supply, they're all attached to the system. Now, you're probably wondering, oh, what are the controls on this one? That's what this little thing is for. Take that off. And there they are. And these are probably some of the coolest little controllers. Look at the thing. Now, the cool thing about this is it's a joystick, but you could also twist it. You can see there. You can twist it like a paddle on the Atari. You could pull it, and you could push it. Now that's pretty important in things like hockey, because in hockey, using this kind of as a way to show it, if this was your TV screen, I guess it'd be better just do it like this. So you have your goalie right here, you have your goalie right here, then you have a player in front and a player in front, and then the ball. Your paddle stays straight to start, but if you twist the controller, your paddle actually twists diagonally. Then the ball will start to careen depending on how much you twist. When you pull up and down, this actually moves your goalie. So you're technically controlling two different pieces while playing that. And I thought that was pretty clever and unique and really complex to think, if you think about having to focus on both of those things. That's what the Fairchild system ended up doing. And I wanted to make a note about him because he was very much a reason why this came to be. He helped design it, and he helped lead a team that created said cartridges. Again, this is not a cartridge for this system, but what they did is these ROM chips, which I have a chip somewhere. I'm going to do a big thing on the history of the cartridges all the way up to what we have nowadays with CDs, and then now we got cloud and all that crazy stuff. So I'll try to show you what the inside looks like, but basically they decided, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put them inside of this casing, and these are supposed to kind of look like the 8-track. Hopefully you guys have heard of 8-track, but essentially there's an 8-track. Again, I'm going to say that a lot, but there's an 8-track somewhere in this room. But they're supposed to look like the 8-track because, again, this is the 70s we're talking about here. But this is the man that I'm talking about. The handsome devil right there. That is Jerry Lawson. And as you can see, that's the Channel F advertisement. Those are the cartridges. That's cool. I didn't realize that was going to get cartridges in there. But that's the cartridges. Not a whole lot different than these. They're bigger. But, yeah, that's the man. And he went on to leave Fairchild, and then he created a company called Videosoft, and then they made a bunch of games for the Atari, and then he did a bunch of other incredible things. He's the reason why, honest to God, probably why one of the reasons why, I guess I should say, why the console realm made it to where it's at, in my opinion. I mean, without him and without the reprogrammable ROM, I may not be doing this right now. If you really think about it. But, I don't know, some people might debate that. But he's definitely one of my heroes. Oh, and by the way, a shout out to one of my other heroes, Hitoshi Matsumoto. It was his birthday yesterday. I want to say he turned 50. Maybe he's in his mid-50s now, but お誕生日おめでとうございます Matsumoto-san. Let's see. I didn't want to mention the Fairchild. Not only was the Channel F was not only the first to use a cartridge, it also was the first to use a microprocessor, which was necessary to allow ROMs to even be utilized. So that was also a big reason why the Channel F is such a humongous part of the legacy of consoles themselves. Previously, the games would be basically soldered into the system, and hence why you only had a couple games built in. But the microprocessor allowed for ROMs to be utilized. One of the big problems with the Channel F, and I noticed it when I was listening to what few, sadly, interviews there are of Jerry Lawson on YouTube, is the marketing in Fairchild, I guess, at least when it came to that system, wasn't all that great, and their library was tiny. I think there's only 28 cartridges that were ever created. So I'm sure you've noticed if you ever go to a flea market, you'll see billions of cartridges for this, the Atari 2600, but probably none for the Channel F. And there's a reason for that, because there's hundreds of games for the Atari 2600, but only 20 for the F channel. That's going to play an important factor, the fact that there were so many games for this when it comes to the video game crash of 1983. So make sure to keep that in mind as we go along. Now, again, this is the fabled Atari 2600. Most people that are into the history of gaming know this system. This one is iconic for a lot of reasons, one of which, and I have it, I swear I have it, but I didn't pull it out because that's what she said, because I'm going to talk more about that kind of stuff in another video. But a lot of the arcade games were being ported onto this Atari 2600, and in particular Space Invaders, which was massive, absolutely massive when it came over to the Atari 2600. In fact, when Space Invaders came onto the Atari 2600, the sales of that game and the system itself increased by 4 times as a result of that. And I believe to this day, Space Invaders is the highest selling game of all time. I could have swore that I wrote down the number because I was never going to remember all the numbers. Might be on here. I don't know. But literally, it is the highest selling game of all time in terms of video games. Space Invaders. Which is pretty crazy considering. I mean, it's not, to me, it's not really bare bones. I mean, it's pretty complex. You know, you got to take a strategy, I guess, in some ways when it comes to what you shoot and all that stuff. But because of that, you started to see third-party companies that would make the games. Originally, it was basically the company that made the system would make the games, but you were starting to see third parties come about, and Atari is a big reason for that. A lot of people at Atari got disgruntled with the way Atari bigwigs were handling things and treating people, and so some former employees from Atari actually branched off and formed Activision, which I believe a lot of people that are watching this are going to know who Activision is. And so Activision actually was a branch off of ex-Atari employees, and they're credited as being pretty much the first third-person video game developer ever. And that was, again, in large part to the Atari 2600 and to Atari in general, which, again, Sunnyvale, California, baby. That's not too far from me. The big problem, though, which I said I just mentioned, is that when you have an oversaturation of games, you tend to get some pretty shitty games. And that was one of the big problems, is more and more companies were trying to jump onto this bandwagon, because during the second generation, video games were kind of getting big. People liked the idea that instead of having to go to an arcade to play one of the games they like, they could have it on their own console at home, and they could play at their leisure. The problem is, because everyone wanted to jump on that bandwagon, you had all these games that were basically just clones of other games. I mean, there's very few side-scrolling shooters that really stand out. I mean, a side-scroller is a side-scroller for the most part. Nothing really stood out after a certain amount of time. And that oversaturation, coupled with the problem that the market still wasn't known yet. Again, it seems bizarre to think about considering how things are nowadays. I mean, think about the money that is being made through the video game world. Not just for companies like Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, and so on with the consoles, but imagine what companies like Rockstar, especially Rockstar nowadays, Ubisoft, it's another big one. Altus is, I like Atlas. One of my favorite games of all time was made by them, but Activision, I believe Activision is still around. I think they got bought out though. But just imagine all the money that they're making. This guy was not part of that. That market was still not known yet, and so that lack of knowledge in the market, coupled with the oversaturation of not only games, but there was a lot of consoles. Let's see, there was the Intellivision, which I noticed during this time period there was a lot of games that used that numerical key, like you had a phone in your hand kind of thing, because you had the Intellivision, which I've never run across, and the ColecoVision, which we actually owned that for a little while and then had to give that back to my uncle. I believe this is actually a remastered version of the system, but this is what it looked like. And again, this had that weird cell phone-ish like controller with the joystick on top. I did also want to mention, I forgot to mention, with this Telestar, there was another version of this. I just happened to stumble upon it, but there was a beefier version called the Telestar Arcade. And look at that. I mean, are you kidding me? So you gotta drive. It was this huge triangle, and it looks like you had for fighting games it would be here, I guess. I'm trying. It's hard to see. I can't see what it says up there. But it might have just been Pong, and maybe I see these slam things, so I'm not quite sure if maybe it just boosted your paddle. I never knew this even existed. But then you kind of gun over here, and then you got a racing unit over here. It's like, what? It's pretty cool. Didn't know about that, actually. But that oversaturation of consoles, those were just a few, but there was a hell of a lot more. Those were kind of the ones that still stood out. And then I guess the picture that I had of the Odyssey 2 was having issues. But the Odyssey 2 also came out. So Mandabox did put out a successor to that, but it didn't do quite as well. Most of those systems didn't do well. Again, even the Fairchild, the Channel F didn't do very well. But the Atari 2600, by far and away, was the console that won out the second generation. If you guys are interested in who was tops, I will mention that as we go on, and you'll start to see rivalries form. Obviously, I think the Odyssey, the Magnavox Odyssey, kind of came out on top from that first gen, just because it was the first. There really wasn't a clear winner, I suppose, in the first gen, but in the second gen, without a doubt, the 2600 made it. I mean, it's still relevant today. People are still wanting to play the old games. There's Atari, legacy collection games for like the PS2, and you could play old Atari games on the PS2 and so on and so forth like that. But I think if you tell any basic video game enthusiast, hey, name a vintage, an old, or what do you think is the oldest video game console? The Atari is probably going to be the one that comes up first for them. The Atari 2600 is going to be the first that comes up for them. I did want to mention before I forget, I don't, as you saw in the beginning of this, I only have two handheld consoles. The Sega Game Gear and the Sega the Nintendo Game Boy Color. But in the first generation, I guess it's the first generation. It might have been considered the second generation. But Mattel, which most people know for their toys, created the first handheld game, technically considered the first handheld game, which was Auto Race. And then in 1979, Milton Bradley, invented the Microvision, which was the first handheld that had interchangeable cartridges. The Game Boy, which everyone knows, came out in 1989 from Nintendo, which will be part of the third generation. And then the Game Gear came out in 1991, but was considered part of the fourth generation, which you will get to see in a little bit, and we'll talk just a little bit about that one. But I do have a Game Gear. So the Game Gear would be the oldest of the handhelds that I have. But because of, again, for like the 1,000th time, because of the oversaturation of the consoles and the oversaturation of games, and the terrible knowledge of the market at the time, the legendary video game crash of 1983 happened. Almost no games were made in 1984. I think people thought that fad had come and gone. Again, sounds crazy in this day and age, but people thought that fad had come and gone. And you didn't see really any games or consoles being made until the third generation came along, and that brought the video game market back and began what really became the ascent to where it is today. Did want to throw out, I tried my best to get prices and everything from the time, just to get a reference to how expensive they were and so on and so forth. But the Channel F sold for a couple cents shy of $170, which was $763 in today's money. And the Atari actually sold for just shy of $200, which is the equivalent of like $839. So this was not a cheap console in its day. It was a very expensive console. I also meant to mention the Channel F, the Nintendo, the Famicom, and I think that's it, were secondhand bought. All the other systems that you saw on this bed we're the original owners. We're the original owners of this. We're the original owners of everything else. So I think that's kind of cool too, that we all bought these things, more or less new at the time, which is pretty awesome, I think. But yeah, so one other thing, I did actually write that down. As I said, the Channel F was kind of a flop, which is sad because of how important it was. But it only sold about 250,000, so only about 250,000 of those, more or less, were sold, while the Atari, almost 30 million of those ones were sold, which again is why it ended up winning the second generation, and again why you see so many of these guys at flea markets, but also why you see so many of the games that come with it. So with the third generation, which they considered came about in 1983, but really it was just a bit after that. The crash didn't last as long as it, I'm kind of making it out to be, but it lasted long enough that for about it's kind of like the lockouts in sports. You know, when you look at them down the line, it's like, oh, okay, that wasn't so bad. But when you live them, it's like, whoa. But this generation was the revival of the video game market. And for those of you that know me as a proud, although I don't look like it, Japanese man, this was actually this big shift from the video game market coming from the United States to shifting over to Japan. And a lot of the companies that were dominating were coming from Japan, which still is a big thing today. So we're talking about older than me. We're talking about 30, 35 years ago is when the big shift happened. The cool thing I like to mention as a kind of a homer when it comes to the Bay Area is most of the companies, Coleco was based out of the East Coast, but Magnavox and Atari, you know, the two big ones that kind of started everything, came out of the Bay Area. And a lot of some of the early video game developers came out of the Bay Area. One of them, which I'll talk about in a little bit, or in the next generation actually, with the Sega Genesis, was Accolade. And I'll talk about Accolade in a little bit, a little spittoon about that. But Accolade was actually based out of, looks like San Jose, at least on the back of this particular game that I got. So that was kind of cool. But this is where Japan started to rise up to the surface of the video game world. So much so that when Nintendo came out with these two bad boys, you started to have what was called the Nintendo craze. And the reason for that was people wanted to buy... Now, I should probably clean that up a little bit. Make sure that people are aware. These are both related. Like, they're like cousins. I guess they're brothers. They're from the same generation. It's the same thing. In Japan, you had the Famicom, and then in the United States you had the Nintendo. These are the same generation. That's why I consider them more like cousins. These are the same generation of games, but not only were the systems vastly different, but as I reach over and grab some, you have, there we go, two vastly different cartridges as well. So you have that fun boy right there, and then this would be the Famicom's cartridge, which actually looks more like a Sega Genesis cartridge in terms of its size than this humongous thing. But these, let's get those out of the way. These blew up the market, especially in 1987, which is a year before I was born. In that 1987 market, 65%, we're not really talking so much about this one because this one was only made for Japan, but in the United States, 65% of video game consoles sold in that 1987 market was just on this one alone. Atari accounted for just a little shy of a quarter, and then Sega was coming in at 8%, and then everyone else was 3%. 65% of the market was just for this bad boy alone. And it got to a point where kids in particular, were being peer pressured by their friends and whatnot to get a Nintendo. You had to be cool and get a Nintendo. If not, you were square, you know? Kids and families that had parents, you know, dads and whatnot, that worked in the computer industry and had these, you know, high-powered computers for the time, wanted these instead. And they had to get one of these instead. So Nintendo managed to actually outsell personal PCs, which that was a big deal in the 80s. I mean, that was when the personal PC was starting to get really, really big. And it managed to outsell those. 61.9 million of these sold. That's how huge that Nintendo craze was during that time period. And as I obviously just ranted out about that, which by the way I thought that was kind of cool. I've never owned this one before. I was a little too young. The next generation we're going to talk about is what I kind of grew up with as a kid. But obviously this was the big one. This was the one that dominated that time period. But there was two others that really kind of sort of made it, as I just mentioned, in terms of sales. And that was Atari, which is the last time Atari really kind of was still relevant in the video game console world. And that was with this, the Atari 7800, which in my opinion is one of the most bland and kind of looks like a laptop that's closed. But like I said, 24% of the market was towards this Atari 7800. And Sega, which was just up and coming at the time, was able to capture 8% of sales with this bad mamma jamma, the Sega Master System. Now, note that Sonic the Hedgehog is on here right now, and everyone associates Sonic the Hedgehog with Sega, which I'll talk about in a minute. I believe this is actually a later game, like my Kirby I showed you guys earlier. That Kirby game was kind of overpowered for its time period. That, I believe it was also on the Super Famicom. That particular one was on the Super Famicom. So the graphics were basically pushing the Famicom to its limits. I have a feeling this game was probably doing the same thing. I'll explain why in just a minute. But Sega did come into the market with the Sega Master System and did okay. I mean, it lagged far behind Atari and obviously Nintendo. But as we'll find out in this next gen, for Atari, that was pretty much it, was with that 7800. Perhaps the biggest thing of all was the birth of a lot of games that would become franchises, icons, cultural icons, things that these companies would stick to. Funny enough, I'm looking at them now. One of the things that stuck. One of the things that I noticed is one game in particular that really came about during this time period actually ended up becoming a cultural icon for a completely different system, which I think is pretty neat. But some of the big cultural icons that came in this period were Mega Man, although in Japan he was known as Rockman. This is Rockman 3. I was actually given, not this cartridge, it's somewhere else, but I was given this as a gift. I don't remember which family member gave this to me, or family friend gave this to me, the other one. But this one came with the Famicom that I bought. There was also Bomberman. This is Bomberman 2. One of my favorite games of all time. I'm going to probably do a video one of these days on that. That's going to suck. It's like choosing who your favorite kids are. I know it's a cliche. But Bomberman World, I think is what it was on the Nintendo 64. But Bomberman came about. This is obviously Bomberman 2, but it came about during this time. Definitely not easy compared to Bomberman World. I never finished Bomberman World. I would love to do that. That would be a little bucket list thing of mine. But of course the big one would be the Mario Brother games. This one is, I believe this is actually the original, the Super Mario Brothers. Obviously this is a dual one with Duck Hunt. I gotta keep an eye out for that, by the way. I don't have the gun. I've seen it, but I haven't bought one yet. Also depends if I get that thing ready. But the Mario Brothers came about during this time period, which to this day still rings relevant. Mario Brothers is pretty much synonymous when it comes to Nintendo. Oops. Zelda also came about during this time period. This game is pretty interesting too because the big thing about the cartridges in this generation is you started in. I will take this one apart when we talk about the history of cartridges and CD-ROMs and all that. And you can feel it with this one. there's a battery, I want to say right up in this corner right here. And between the battery and the board memory, you could actually finally save games. Usually you have to keep playing, or if you know, before the pause button, you had to turn off the game and restart it again. Then when the pause button came, you could go walk around, do what you need to do, come back. But then this one allowed you to start saving the game because the games are starting to get bigger. There were a lot more than just play a level and then replay it again and again. You know, you started to get actual games with storylines, and you know, you had to sit down and play them for a while. But Zelda came about because of that, and I think it's pretty cool that Zelda, this particular Zelda, the original one, was the first to have a battery inside of it, so you could save your data. Which, you know, we take that for granted nowadays, but that didn't exist until this guy. And for me, the most important, I don't know where that red light's coming from. Oh yeah, it's coming from the camera itself. I forgot that has a little light on it. The most important one, Metal Gear. I'm probably going to end up playing this, unless I get the Nintendo to work, on the PS2. I believe I bought a version of Metal Gear 3 Snake Eater, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, that has the two games, this one, and I don't know if that's, did I bring that upstairs? I have Snake Eater up here. Snake Eater was technically the sequel to this, Metal Gear 2. But remember, this is Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2. The one that I grew up with is Metal Gear Solid, so it's a little different than this. Yeah, Metal Gear came about, and Metal Gear is a huge thing for me in my video gaming world. I literally will probably do a massive video on just the history of the Metal Gear series. But that came about during this time period. The fourth generation came about after the discontinuation of, I believe, the NES. And it started out with a system that I didn't know about, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't know about other than big-time, you know, video game enthusiasts. It was known as the NEC Home Electronics PC Engine, or, as you see on the screen, the TurboGrafx 16. Now, technically, which, by the way, the previous generation, I forgot to mention that. According to this, the third generation ended in 2003, so that went from 1983 to 2003. Excuse me, according to experts. Oh, and by the way, the NES and the Famicom roughly were about $180 or $430 in today's money. But yeah, they said that the generation ended in 2003. I thought I saw somewhere that it might have been the Super Nintendo, but Japan was still repairing them all the way up until like when I went back in 2017, and then they finally stopped doing that because they ran out of parts, I guess, or whatever. Which I don't really understand. Why can't you just remake the parts? But but that was the 8-bit era. Forgot to mention that. Now we've entered the 16-bit era, and the fourth generation went from 1987 to 2004. So again, the third generation lasted a lot longer than I think more than any other generation when you really think about its longevity. And obviously, it's still being used today. I mean, hell, I'm going to play some games from the third generation. Now I'll play some games from the second generation. I'd play some from the first generation if I had them. But this is the 16-bit era. And this system claimed it was a 16-bit system. But technically, and this is a little beyond my realm of expertise, but technically this was considered a modified 8-bit CPU system. So it wasn't quite a 16-bit system, but this was the one that started it off. But the true big ones, and again, as you'll notice, Atari, you won't hear a lot about Atari anymore. Atari kind of fell out the map, and now this is when the Japan dominance starts to rise up to the surface. The two big ones in particular, as most people know, were the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. As you can see, that's how that should be colored all the way through. I live with two smokers, and hence why that kind of looks the way it does. But these were the two consoles that really, truly excelled during that time period. As we mentioned in the previous generation, Mario was pretty much the go-to guy for Nintendo, and he kind of became the face of the Nintendo franchise. Sega during this generation, and I remember I mentioned with the Master System, I think that was a overpowered game for that system, just like this Kirby was. This was made for the Famicom, 1993. This was towards the end of the Famicom era, and it probably would have worked better with the Super Famicom. This is not the Super Famicom, but the Super Nintendo's cousin, the Super Famicom. This would have been just as good. So the graphics on this were incredible for the Famicom's era. I think Sonic the Hedgehog was, because yes, Sonic. This is obviously a Game Gear. This is the only Sonic game I own, believe it or not. I own one Sonic game. That Zelda was the first Zelda game that I've ever owned, and I just bought it yesterday. I'm a Californian that's never smoked weed. I mean, I'm behind the 8 ball with a lot of things. But in the video game world, yeah, I've never played a Zelda game before. It's the very first one I've owned, and this is the only Sonic the Hedgehog game that I own. And again, this is on the Game Gear, which I should have mentioned that one. Oh no, this is part of that generation. So actually, you get to go right here. Forgot about that guy. I said I only own 2 handheld consoles. I'm not a big handheld kind of guy, but that actually goes with that. But Sega found its cultural icon with Sega, and that was a huge deal for the Sega Genesis, because they needed an answer to what Super Nintendo or Nintendo had when it came to Mario. Now, as you can see, there's still the ROM era. We're still dealing with ROM cartridges like the Super Nintendo. So that would be their cartridge. Slide that in there like that. And you have the Sega Genesis cartridge. Like that. But this is actually the first generation where we did technically see the beginning of what could be, or what was the CD-ROM era. Unfortunately, it didn't go quite that well, which was this bad boy, the Philips CDI console set. Kind of looks basically like a DVD player, but that was the original one. There was another version of it that looked a little bit more like a gaming system, but this was the one that started it. It was, excuse me, it did not go well. It had a little bit of success, but it did not go all that well. And so instead, we still have the cartridge ROM dominating this particular time period. So the fourth generation, actually, and you'll start to see this more and more, where generations became more and more overlap. The 5th generation actually came in technically around 1944, more or less. Actually, the 5th generation started in 1993, but it kind of started kicking dirt around 1944. But the 4th gen did manage to kind of putter along for another couple years, but then it finally kind of diminished in 1996, and technically this generation ended with the Neo Geo. I apologize, I don't have a picture of that, but the Neo Geo from Sega, when that was discontinued in 2004, that officially ended this 4th generation. Now, the big thing to note here with this generation is the big rivalry that had started in the 3rd generation and really took off in the 4th generation was the rivalry between Nintendo and Sega. Now, one of the things that helped Sega, despite the fact that the Super Nintendo, which came in 2 years later than this guy, and still won, technically the Super Nintendo won this generation with 49.1 million consoles sold. But one of the things that kept Sega going was they allowed more adult-oriented games. Nintendo was really trying to push this idea of family-friendly games. The violence that was starting to come about in video games, because now video games are starting to get more graphically realistic, put Nintendo in a kind of different group when it came to what they were trying to sell versus the Sega Genesis. In particular, one game, which I just happened to have found yesterday, and most people should know, is the famous Mortal Kombat. This game caused a lot of controversy, as most people know, because of how graphic its violence is. However, Mortal Kombat outsold 3-1 over most games during this time period because of its graphicness and it was realistic. I watched a really cool interview with the creator of this game. Unfortunately I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but they were talking about how they were able to use like realistic images of people to for the game itself, which was kind of unique for its time. Top of that, the game that really helped keep the NES alive, though, to the end of that era, because I know I mentioned that it did kind of click over into the 5th generation, was Donkey Kong Country, which I could have got yesterday, but I didn't want to pay that much money. I will maybe end up buying that from them because I've kind of developed a rapport. They're the people that I bought the Zelda, Donkey Kong, and this Mortal Kombat game from. Right here. So, I might still buy that one. I would love to. I always wanted to own it. But Donkey Kong Country kind of helped the NES, or the SNES, the Super Nintendo, stay alive because it was kind of like one of the first games that utilized the 3D graphics that really became prevalent in the 5th generation, which was kind of the reason why the 5th generation pushed aside this 4th generation right here. The Genesis, or Mega Drive as it was known in Japan, actually did really poorly in Japan compared to the Nintendo, but it did extremely well in the North America and in Europe and in Brazil. Brazil in particular was a huge market in South America, and it did well in all 3 of those ones. And again, a lot of that had to do with the more mature adult-oriented games versus the Nintendo, which had the more family-friendly ones. Because of Sega's more violent games, a big issue with what violent video games were doing with young kids and so on and so forth. You had Columbine that was happening during this time period, and so on and so forth. And so they were wondering, they were dealing with music, Marilyn Manson, and all that stuff. And people know that, but we also know that there was a big stink about video games causing violence in teens and kids and whatnot. That caused Sega to actually create what ended up being the predecessor. And I should have pulled one of those out. Let me actually go do that real quick. They created what is called the Video Game Rating Council. That's not a good one. Video Game Rating Council. And that is that little guy right there. I don't know how well that'll zoom in, especially with all the shininess. MA13, Mature 13. Sorry, that sounded great. Let me see if I can... Let's see if that'll show better. No, because we're not that light. But anyways, that's what came about as a result of Sega's games being a bit on the touchy side for some of the older generation that wasn't too big on that heavy violence and all that stuff. That rating system would be the predecessor to what we know today as the ESRB, or the Entertainment Software Rating Board, which is that guy right there, with the reason why. Sorry, again, it's kind of hard to get in there, but the reason why it got that rating. So, Sega, we can thank for the ESRB today, which is good. I think it's important to have that on there. One thing I did want to mention, I mentioned Accolade earlier, which would be Accolade. Accolade was a company based out of, kid you not, Stevens Creek Boulevard. Sorry, I know it's not going to zoom in all that well. San Jose, California. Oh, sorry. Yeah, San Jose, California. That sounded weird coming out of my mouth. And they got into a lawsuit because of this actual system right here. Now, this is the Sega Genesis 3 model right here. If it looks kind of weird to some people. And what happened is when the Genesis came out, Accolade, who was a third-party company, bought a system and bought a couple games, and they basically decompiled the game to try to figure out what the security code was. And by overriding that security code, they were able to make games that were unlicensed, because I guess Sega's licensing program really kind of like stuck it to companies, and there really wasn't a lot of incentive to make games because you couldn't really make a whole lot of profit. So Accolade was like, well, screw this. We're going to decompile this game, and we're going to get that code, and we're going to break it. And so the game that came out of that was a game called Ishido: The Way of the Stones. And that one was a result of that fact that Accolade was able to break the security system. So Sega, realizing that, decided to make this guy right here. This system had a new security thing called the trademark security system. And if a game happened to have, if it was a properly licensed game, had the string of code that said Sega or whatever, the system would recognize it and it would accept it, and when it loaded up, it would say produced by or under license from Sega Enterprise Limited. If it didn't have that string of code, then the system would not start up. It's kind of similar to the 10 NES I mentioned earlier, where if a game wasn't licensed, then the system would just blink, and so the screen would just blink. This is kind of doing the same thing. Well, what did Accolade do? They bought the new system, they got the games, then they broke it again, and they made a couple other games. And then this big lawsuit happened, which ended up being settled, I think, out of court. But that was kind of a big thing that happened with the game crash, too, is you had a lot of companies that were making bootlegs of things, and during the second generation, and that was kind of becoming an issue. And so that's why Nintendo made that 10 NES code or system lockout for their Nintendo system, and then it kind of came on through here. That's also a big reason why CDs were kind of questioned, because CDs were really easy to crack into, and that's going to be a big thing with the next generation we're going to talk about here in just a minute. But the big battle over Sega and Nintendo, I said, really started in this generation. Again, Sega was kind of pushing the older, mature players with these more mature titles. Like I said, you have the Game Gear, by the way. Just wanted to make sure I mentioned right here. This thing took freaking 6 AA batteries. And then this would be the game. If you guys were curious, like I said, I'll talk about it more. But this is how the cartridges looked. So they're a little bit bigger than the Game Boy, which will come out a little bit later, but there's the cartridge right there. Pops right into the back. Oops, like so. Yeah. Get that back in there. That may not. Oh yeah, there we go. There we go. Now we're cooking with gas, folks. But Nintendo still won this era, but Sega was really starting to show that they were going to be a force for Nintendo, and that would carry on into the next generation. Unfortunately for Sega, the downfall was going to begin in that next generation, which is sad because their next system is one of my favorites of all time. But for Sega, this was probably the cream of the crop right here, was the Sega Genesis. And then Nintendo would kind of carry themselves away, but a new company, not necessarily a new company in terms of how long they've been around, but a new company was going to come into the video game fold with the fifth generation. We come into the fifth generation, and this is considered to be the 32-bit and 64-bit and the 3D era. This, in my opinion, would be the era. So I grew up as a kid, a very small kid, with the fourth generation. Truly, in particular, with the Super Nintendo. And it seems kind of fitting. My dad played a lot of games on the Genesis, namely Pirates Gold. That one really stands out to me. But I grew up with the Super Nintendo, and some of the fondest memories of mine, which I will play another time, was my grandfather, who passed when I was really young, keeping my score in a lot of games. And I said I would get about playing those games at another time. This is the generation where I was starting to appreciate video games a lot differently. I was a little more cognizant about wow, my goodness, I think I just dropped 10 pounds. Where I was starting to really appreciate the, I guess, the quality of games and the substance of games. In particular, as I will mention, and you've seen in the very beginning of this one, the Sony systems, the PlayStation systems, were the ones that have shaped me to this day. In fact, on my desk, where most of the reviews are going to happen, there's a PlayStation 3 and a PlayStation 2 set up. Well, it's not set up right now because we're going to talk about it in the next one to finish this off. But in my opinion, probably the three greatest systems in my life outside of the Super Nintendo is the 64, even though I don't have a lot of games for it, the Sega Saturn, even though I don't have a lot of games for it, and the PlayStation 1, which I have a lot of games for that one. This might actually be my favorite game system of all time for a number of reasons, which I'll explain about on another day when I talk about the system itself. Yeah. Scratchies. But as you can see, this was the technically, as I mentioned before, the Philips CDI was the first to do CDs, and it was not a great success. This was the first great success. The fifth generation brought a number of things before I get into that. One was, this is the first time we were really seeing 3D polygon graphics and textured mappings. ROMs were now up to 650 megabytes because you were using, for the first time on a successful scale, CDs. The CD quality also allowed audio and speech to finally become usable. You know, they always talk about the 8-bit and 16-bit music. These were the first ones where you could actually have real people's voices on a game. Case in point, Metal Gear. Case in point, things like I guess Panzer Dragon, except Panzer Dragon really wasn't in English, wasn't in any language for that matter. Virtual Fighter, you know, they had the characters would make noises and all that stuff. But this was the generation where you started to get realistic sounds out of them and all that fun jazz. Some of these ones were the first to offer internet capability. In particular, you'll notice, and I, for years, was trying to wonder, why is there a cartridge thing up here? It don't fit, look at it, it don't fit any of the Sega Genesis. I thought, oh, maybe that's what it's for. It doesn't fit anything like that. I finally found out, oops, leave that open for a bit, why that's there. The reason is this Sega Saturn Netlink. And this allowed you, as you can see, to basically hook up an ether cable to your Sega Saturn and have internet capabilities. I don't know the extent to what you could do with internet on these, because the internet was still kind of in its infancy during this time period. But one system actually had it built in, which again we take for granted nowadays, I'm sure. And that was the Apple Pippin. Yeah, Apple that makes the iPads and iPhones and all that fun stuff. That was their venture into the video game world back in the 90s. And that one had a built-in internet capabilities. It did not do well. It did terribly. I have never seen one. I would love to see one, but I've never seen one. But it was the first to have onboard internet capabilities, and even though it was a flop, that's pretty important because nowadays apparently the PS2 has internet capabilities, but I've never used it. The PS3 has internet capabilities, PS4 has internet capabilities, and all the other systems as well has internet capabilities. And we owe this little guy, the Pippin, the Apple Pippin, for that capability, and this generation as a whole. But the top three systems, and these would kind of be the ones that would fight for dominancy kind of into the next generation, but we would see a drastic shift, is the Sony PlayStation, the Nintendo 64, and the Sega Saturn. Sega and Nintendo obviously were the top companies during this time period. Sony had just gotten into the market with this. Again, this is a PS1. It's kind of hard to see, but this is a PS1. There's two freaking PlayStations somewhere around here, but I do have the PS1, and the PS1 actually does work. So we're just going to use this one. This one came in 2000, and it actually outsold the PS2, mostly because you were still able to buy games at that time because the PS2 was backwards compatible. And that made the PS1 a little bit more, I guess, desirable because it was still cheap-ish. I don't know exactly if I got the prices. Yeah, I don't have the prices specifically on the PS1, but it helped the PS1 or the PS, I guess, the PlayStation still stay relevant even in the next generation. But PlayStation kind of took over, and there's a reason for that, which we'll explain as we go along in this generation. But just keep in mind, Sony, which has just come into the market. Obviously, Sony's a huge electronics organization, but when they came into the market, they were new compared to Sega and Nintendo, who were the two giants of that particular time period. I did want to throw out real quick, I wanted to get the handheld thing out of the way, because after this, I don't really care about the handheld market. Obviously, we know that there's DS's, PSPs and all that stuff. I'm not really worried about that. I'm more worried about the consoles. I just happen to have these, so I did want to mention them. During the 5th generation, the handheld market actually struggled mightily. It did really terrible. The Sega Nomad only lasted for 2 years. I thought I had a picture, but it didn't really work. But essentially, it looked kind of like a Game Gear, like this guy. But instead, you could actually put you could basically put a cartridge, like a Sega Genesis cartridge, right in there. That didn't fare too well. The Virtual Boy, which unfortunately I don't have a picture of the system itself, but I think a lot of people have seen it. Kind of looks like a VR headset, but attached to a tripod. Had a big problem where that was what you saw, those color schemes, and you would get headaches and eye issues and all that stuff. And so it didn't fare too well, and that only lasted about a year. Instead, the only thing that dominated was the Game Boy Color. Now, as you can see, I have the special edition one, and the reason why is, as you can see, with Pikachu-chan, Pika-chan, Togepi-chan, Jigglypuff-chan, is because of the Pokemon series. Wow. When these came out, Game Boys went nuts. Believe me, Pokemon in general went nuts. I could do a whole thing on just the Pokemon craze. And it was kind of important because I learned a lot about... I'll explain that more when I play it, because I can play it on the 64. So I will be doing that on the 64. But this was the only system that really dominated during that time period. And this came in 1998. So this came in quite a little bit later than when the generation actually started. It's interesting to note there actually was considerable overlap between this generation. Oh, let me move you a little bit. Oh, you can see that. There you go. Between this generation, the next generation, which started in 1998, actually on 11/27/1998. So that would be 3 days before my 11th birthday. Jesus. When the Dreamcast, Sega Dreamcast came out, which I don't own, but I have seen quite a few. The almighty Dreamcast. I have a chance to buy one, but I don't know if they have power supplies, but that's not here nor there. And then when the 5th generation actually finally technically ended, it ended on the 3rd of March, or I mean on the 23rd of March 2006, when the PS1, this guy right here, was discontinued. I'm going to move you over now. And that was 1 year after the launch of the PS3. So this guy was still relevant a year after its grandchild was kicking it and kicking ass and whatnot. So that just tells you how amazing this not only was this generation, because if we talk about, again, in the 3rd generation, that lasted almost 20 years, whereas the 5th generation only lasted 13, and 2 generations popped up during that time period after that. It's pretty interesting to think about. Now, the Saturn. Let's talk about the Saturn a little bit here. So the Saturn's big problem was the launch for it was pretty bad. They didn't do a great job about it, and sorry about that. I figured that was going to happen eventually. It also was very, very expensive compared to the other systems. The Nintendo 64 was just shy of $200. $200 was about $326 in its day. The PlayStation, the original PlayStation, was about $300, which is $500. This guy was actually $400, which is almost close to $700. So this was a very expensive system in its day. The biggest Achilles heel for the Sega Saturn, there was 2 Achilles heels for both, but for this one, the biggest Achilles heel was a Sega game a Sonic the Hedgehog game never made it onto the Sega Saturn. And considering that was their cultural icon, their brand symbol. That was a big deal for the Sega Saturn. I did want to throw out, by the way, I don't have a picture of it, but the Atari did try to throw out the Jaguar, which wanted to claim that it was a 64-bit system, but a lot of people questioned that whether or not it was a 64-bit because it was using two 32-bit processors that worked in tandem, a Tom and Jerry processor thing, which again, that's way over my head. And the library for that Atari system, which is ironic considering how massive the 2600 library is, wasn't big enough to keep up with the other systems. The 64's big problem was this. It was the last major system until the Switch. Nintendo actually came back and did it again. With the Switch, with the new generation, newish generation, I guess. But they decided to go with ROMs, cartridge ROMs, as opposed to CD ROMs, like the Super Nintendo. And a lot of people believe that was a major problem for the Nintendo 64. Was you have these ROM cartridges that, they get dirty. You have to constantly, clean them unless you can really take good care of them. But you can only hold so much information. Their mentality was a ROM is faster when it comes to the load times compared to a CD, which if anyone's ever played a cartridge game versus a CD game, that's absolutely 100% true. ROMs, other than the cleaning process, again, if you take care of your ROMs, it's not a big deal. Or your cartridge ROM is not a big deal. They're stronger than a CD. I mean, if a CD gets scratched even a little bit, you're pretty much hosed. The big problem with a cartridge is it takes a lot longer to make, and it's a lot more expensive. And the problem is, because of how expensive it was, Nintendo 64 games tended to be a lot more expensive than their rivals when it came to CD-ROMs versus cartridge ROMs. Another big thing is because of how long it took, you had to kind of guess what games were going to do well and make sure you had the demand, or you had the supply to meet the demand. If you didn't, you'd have a shit ton of cartridges that you had to sit on, or if you had not enough and the demand was huge, then you're sitting there trying to rush out this order, which obviously is going to take time. So that was a big problem with the cartridge versus the CD, which again we'll talk more about when we do that particular video. But most experts believe that because Nintendo decided to choose the ROM, the cartridge ROM versus the CD, that was a big reason why Nintendo, who had been the dominant force up to this point, fell and Sony took over. So something interesting to think about is the Nintendo 64 might have been the reason why Nintendo is not the force. I mean, it's still there, and Nintendo's always going to have that name behind it, but that's a reason why Sony jumped so quickly. On top of that, though, is Nintendo. What Nintendo was trying to do, which Sega had done to a certain extent because of their games, is Sony wanted to try to market to the 20 to 30-year-old age range, because that was the first generation of kids that had literally from birth all the way up, more or less grown up with video games. They were completely saturated with this idea of video games. Like, my parents were born pre-video games, so they couldn't appreciate someone that was, born in the early 80s or whatever, that grew up with video games. PlayStation's ability to market that age range was massive, and it's the reason why the PlayStation was actually the very, very first system to ship 100 million units worldwide. The very first system to do it was the Sony PlayStation. Now, in terms of Oh, I forgot to mention, I didn't get a picture of that one. There was another system, and if you're interested, please look it up. It doesn't look as amazing as what you think. But this was the era where this thing called the 3DO interactive multiplayer came out. And maybe I'll do another separate thing about that because this is so fascinating. As I said, the PlayStation sold for $300, 64 was $200, and the Saturn was $400. The 3DO interactive multiplayer sold for $700. That's $12,000 in today's market. And obviously it didn't do well because no one knows about it. Well, I didn't know about it, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't know about it. I'm definitely going to probably maybe do a video on that, on just the history of that, because that's a lot of money for a system. There was a reason for it. I looked up a little bit of it, but I didn't want to talk too much about it in this particular video. But man, $1,200. That's a lot of money. I don't think anyone would ever pay for a system like that nowadays, you know? One of the big things, though, that makes the Nintendo 64 such a humongous part of video games, video game history, is, well, obviously there's a lot of games for the PlayStation because I've got a lot of games for the PlayStation. The Nintendo 64 actually didn't have a lot of games, but the games that came out of it were super high quality. Excuse me. In particular, Super Mario 64, which actually beat out Sony's best game, which was Gran Turismo, which, as you'll know, when I play games, I don't really have a whole lot of racing games because I'm terrible at them, and I don't have a lot of fighting games because I'm really terrible at them. But Gran Turismo was the top game that the PlayStation popped out, and that was beaten by Super Mario 64. Now, a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that Mario is an established franchise. But the 64 also had games like Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is considered by many as one of the greatest games of all time, period. And they had GoldenEye 007, which is considered by many to be the greatest first-person shooter of all time. I have actually never played either, but for me, from a first-person perspective, I played Perfect Dark, which I will be playing in one of these videos, and I love that game. That game was brilliant. But Nintendo had always been one of those quality over quantity kind of situations where Sega kind of pushed so many systems, and I think that was another reason why Sega ended up having issues, is they were pushing systems left and right. Nintendo kind of took their time when they threw something out. Sony kind of took their time when they threw something out when it came to systems. Sega was trying to push too much, and it ended up being kind of another issue for them in the long run. But one of the reasons why I'm doing this video, and I'll mention it more in the next video because I'm doing these ones in tandem, is today is the 9th of September 2020, and on the 9th of September in 1995, the PlayStation came about in the United States. So today is technically the anniversary of, or the 25th anniversary of the PlayStation console coming to the United States. So definitely wanted to do the shout out there, and I will be doing a video where I play a bunch of games after this one. So hopefully you all will watch that. Although I think this video will probably end up being posted after that one, or they might be posted in conjunction. I might just do that anyways. We'll see. But it did come out on the 9th of September 1995. And it continued to have games made and sold until 2016, 11 years later after it was launched, and a year before the debut of the PS3. And as I said, the PS1, this console right here, the smaller, slimmer version, which PlayStation would do a lot. You'll see in the next one with the PS2, outsold the PS2 One of the cool things, and I did not take a picture of that one too, I meant to get a picture of that one, is there was a version of the Sony that actually had an LCD screen that would sit like this. And so you could actually play the game with this little LCD screen, and it would hook up to like a car battery, like a carport thing or whatever. So you could play games on portably. So there are versions of that. That is not what this is. This is just a standard PS1. But as I said, Sony was an upstart. They were just getting into the market in 1994. They came out with the PlayStation in 1995. And again, they targeted 15 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 29-year-olds, which were the first to grow up with it. But they were considered the first company to utilize the CD-ROM super successfully. I still think that there are a number of great games. By the way, there are a number of critically acclaimed games that came out of the Sega Saturn as well. I didn't mean to just mention this one. Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragon, all came out of this system. But the PlayStation was the system that really got the CD-ROMs to become the mainstay of games for the next 20 some odd years, 25 years, quarter of a century. And the PlayStation is also the system that really is considered the one that ended the ROM cartridge. Because of how well that PlayStation did, ROMs were no longer utilized. It made more sense to use CDs because CDs could hold so much more information, and games were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And to the point where there were some games that were too big for the CDs. Metal Gear always comes to mind. Metal Gear Solid had 2 discs, and not halfway, but 3/4 of the way through the game, you actually had to swap the disc out, put in the next disc, and then continue on playing. So the CDs brought a whole different realm, and again, I'll talk more about this when I do this cartridge versus CD, so on and so forth. But this generation is where we saw the end of the ROM cartridge, and in particular, this was the one that carried the end of the ROM cartridge, for the most part. Again, this is also the company that also brought it back with the Switch. I also meant to mention, I apologize again, on top of the fact that we're using a pretty archaic PlayStation webcam, the lighting here is terrible because, believe it or not, and I don't think this camera's going to pick it up, but it is yellow outside. No joke, it's yellow outside. Let's see. Let me lift you up. Loosen you. Kid you not. If you're from the Bay Area, this makes sense, but it is. Yeah, see, you're not going to be able to tell through the camera. It's actually yellow outside. Pretty awful. Yes, there we go. Now I'm all flustered. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So that's why I apologize for the terrible quality. It's going to be terrible quality anyways. We're low budget here on the Shōnan Flow. If you want to support us, let me know. I would be very grateful. And all of that money will go towards games. If you want a game in particular or system, I'd be more than happy to try to get a system and play a new system. That would be amazing. But anyways, this is the final generation I'm going to talk about. This is Generation 6. It started technically on November 27th, 1998, as I mentioned, with the Dreamcast, which is this guy again. I don't have it, as I said. I've never even seen games for it, to be honest. I've seen one system. I know there's a system right now that I could buy, but I've never really seen the games. But this is what started the 6th generation of games, again, on the 27th of November 1998, and it ended on January 4th of 2013, which is crazy. I was a third grader when this generation technically started, and I was a year away from graduating college in when this generation ended. That's bizarre. That's a big generation. That's 15 years. It's amazing how much can happen in 15 years. But that's a story for another day, you know? The idea of advertising bits at this point, you know, we talk about the 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, 64-bit. This is technically considered the 120-bit era, but this is really where we see the end of people advertising that. At this point, people are more concerned with with memory, you know, processing speed and all that stuff. So the bit era and technically ends here. It is sometimes called the 128-bit, but you don't really hear that much about it. Pretty much at this point, the handhelds is dominated by Nintendo. Nintendo, for the most part, will continue to dominate. I know there's a PSP, the PlayStation, and all that stuff, but for the most part, Nintendo is the focus factor at this point for handhelds moving forward. And obviously, during this time period, they dominated with the Game Boy Advance, and then in the 7th generation, they dominated with the Nintendo DS. The cool thing about the Dreamcast right here is it actually had a built-in modem and a internet modem and a web browser. This is the period where internet capabilities became a major factor, and we started to see more and more systems utilize the internet capabilities because the internet became more and more accessible to a lot of people and became more and more user-friendly and viable for the video game market and world. The GameCube actually had a few games with the internet, but not quite as much, and they also had few mature titles, and that's one of the reasons why the GameCube had such a hard time. Was again, they weren't really catered to the adult market. Nintendo really focused, even to this day, I really think about it, Nintendo has always been a family-friendly game console company as opposed to Sony, Xbox, so on and so forth. And that kind of hurt their sales. The PlayStation 2 actually rode the success of the PS1, and as I mentioned, the PS1 did really well because of the backwards compatibility, and the PlayStation 2 did well because of that as well. The fact that you could play your old your old games allowed the PS2 it was kind of worth the money because you could play your old games, but you could also play the new games coming in. Whereas, unfortunately, nowadays, although I heard the PS5 might be backwards compatible, but I kind of doubt it. The PS3, the very first PS3 was the last one that I know from Sony that was backwards compatible. And then they stopped because they realized they could make a lot of money remastering games and putting up games that you could buy to load into your system. But because the PS2 could be backwards compatible, that was a big reason why people were willing to pay the money to get the PS2, and why you saw its sales go the way it did. Which in a minute I'll explain. It is the greatest selling console of all time. The Xbox came in during this time period, I should mention. And that one did well as well. It did not gain a good footing in Japan compared to the United States. Obviously, it's a Microsoft company. It's Microsoft that made it. So it did really well in the United States. And a lot of the reason is the advertising in other countries wasn't as great. And Japan, like in many countries, have this strong tradition of supporting products made in their own country. Obviously, we have that in the United States with made in USA products. So the Xbox didn't gain quite as big of a following as the Xbox, or in Japan as it did elsewhere. In terms of the price, though, They were pretty much equal, because again, at this point, we're seeing the drop off of Nintendo to a little bit of an extent, and basically the end of Sega, and we're seeing the rise of Microsoft and the continued dominance of the PS2. So the PlayStation 2 and its rival, which again was Microsoft coming up, was $299 during this time period, which is about $450. The Dreamcast and the GameCube, GameCube, were about $199 or $300 in today's money. So the Dreamcast and the GameCube were actually cheaper. The two dominant companies during the time period were actually cheaper. However, when we look at sales, the Dreamcast, which, like I mentioned, was pretty much the end of Sega, because I think Nintendo actually absorbed Sega, because I've seen some Sonic games on Nintendo games now, which seems sacrilegious. The Dreamcast only sold 9.13 million consoles. The GameCube sold only 22 million, which I shouldn't say only, because the Xbox itself sold 24 million. So there's only a 2 million difference, which seems like a lot, but in the video game console realm, that's not too terribly bad. What's amazing though, and I mentioned before, is the PS2 is the best-selling console of all time. That sold 155 million. This system right here sold 155 million consoles. Apparently has 3,800 plus games, which sold over 1.5 billion copies of games alone for the PlayStation 2 system. And this really skyrocketed Sony and the PlayStation to the dominance of where it's at. I guess right now, although it's sounding like the console may be done after this next generation. It's sounding like more and more like we're going to see cloud-based systems as opposed to physical copies of consoles themselves. But I don't know if that's going to be the case. I'm sure it'll get to that point, but that may just end up happening. This was also a major era where we saw more and more controversy over games because of violence. We started to see sexual themes, racial slurs. Manhunt in particular comes to mind. That game was stupidly violent, purposefully violent. GTA was violent because you could actually attack just normal people on the street, and that resonated with a lot of people. But a big thing was during this time period, the 9/11 attacks happened, and people were really sensitive to anything that could relate in some way to the 9/11 events. And so you had things like Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, where was it Arsenal gear crashes into Manhattan. That was kind of a touchy subject. Obviously, this is not part of that generation. That came out with the PS3, I believe, is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. And I remember they specifically ask, do you want or not want controversial content to be part of your playthrough? And the controversial content is you walk through a airport and you're basically gunning down innocent civilians because you're undercover with a terrorist organization. And so they asked if you didn't want to deal with that kind of content. We also had some big titles coming in for the PS2 as well. Metal Gear Solid 2, as I mentioned. God of War came about with the PS2 era. Shadow of the Colossus, I will definitely be playing that game for you guys. Hopefully in its entirety. Probably at the end of the year, because I had played it before. I'm probably going to do like a big lead up to the end of the year with that. In fact, I'm pretty much going to just pencil that in. That's what's going to happen. And Sony actually made a TV. Well, I've seen ones that weren't Sony built. I think they were Japanese built, but not Sony built, with a PS2 built into the damn TV, which is pretty neat. And then obviously, like I said, the PS3 was also backwards compatible, so that helped kind of continue to build the success of the video games, just like the PlayStation had games that were still being bought when the PS2 came out, and it lasted well into the 7th generation, as I said, ending on January 4th of 2013. And as we venture into the unknowns of the video game world today, like I said, we are supposedly, according to experts past generation 7, I still believe people are still relying on the PlayStation 3, so I think it's going to probably sincerely end at the end of this year for good, but most people claim that it is. I do have a PS3, and I can, if anyone is interested, but I didn't want to talk a whole lot about that one because I did want to finish with this generation, with the 6th generation. We are currently sitting in the 8th generation, and the 9th generation is coming about really soon. Really soon. And as I said, there's a possibility the 9th generation might be the final generation of the home consoles. We might start seeing more cloud-based video gaming, so on and so forth. I mean, if there's still a system, if there's still a little box that you have to hook up to something, a TV or whatever, and that gets hooked up to, something as simple as this. If this is hooked up to the cloud, but you still have to hook up controllers, that's still a console to me. But that's going to be the next big thing afterwards that people think is you're just going to download stuff to a little box and going away. You're doing that already with the PS3 and the PS4. A large majority of my PlayStation games on the PS4 are digitally downloaded as opposed to physical copies. But that's where we are. But in terms of the, you said, very brief, kind of boring history of the console progress that we've made from the Odyssey to, well, I guess where we are today. A lot's happened. A lot has happened. And then the games, well, we're talking about something totally different. But the means of playing those games have changed quite a lot. It's been an incredible journey to see how quickly, technology. Think about all the inventions big inventions throughout life, and how long it took for those inventions to occur. And then look how quickly in the last 40, 50 something years, how much video games have changed and increased and grown. The market, the graphics, the stories. So it's an incredible world. If you're watching this and have never been a video game fan, and you developed something, okay. I don't know how I did that. I don't think I did that. I'm assuming the systems did that. But if you're interested in more, I definitely recommend watching the video game playthroughs that I do, or just video game play sessions that I do, because watching the games is a lot more fun than watching stuff about the systems. But there's a niche, there's a spot for everybody, and I think that's the coolest thing about video games is you can find yourself with a character. There's a character out there for everyone. There's a storyline for everyone out there for a situation you're dealing with, and that's the whole point of video games, especially nowadays, is to just lose yourself. Lose yourself, forget about what's going on in the world, and just play. And nowadays, especially with what's going on nowadays, boy, that couldn't be any more useful, because I think we all could use an escape from the reality we live in, not just in the United States, but just in the world in general, with the pandemic and all that stuff. But hope y'all enjoyed this. Like I said, unfortunately, I'm looking at the clock. We're almost hitting 2 hours, but briefish. Believe me, there's a lot more history to it than just what I mentioned. And obviously, there's a lot more you could talk about with the systems. But hopefully, you enjoyed this brief little history lesson on the generations, video game consoles. As I said, I will be in a video hopefully shortly doing a little PlayStation celebration because it is the 25th birthday of the PlayStation. So happy birthday to the PlayStation. I don't know the birth date on this guy. I'll have to find that out. I will find out the birthday of all the systems, honestly. But I know that today is the birthday of the original PlayStation. So we get to that one. But as always, this is Alex with Shōnan Flow. As always, keep it smooth and keep it flow. Thank you again for watching so much. And we'll see you all in the next video. Toodaloo!